Today we're out at Fort McHenry. We're going to check this place out. The ceremony for the flag should be happening here shortly. And we'll walk around the fort and we'll talk a little bit about the battle that took place here in the bay, securing of the freedom, Francis Scott Key, and the Civil War history that took place here as well. Let's set the stage for what happens out here at Fort McHenry. In April of 1814, Napoleon has been defeated by Britain. Up until that point, Britain was not concerned with the war with the United States. It sent small forces over here and had not really put in much effort here. Once that happens, General Robert Ross gets sent out here to take over and command the forces on the ground. Admiral Cochrane is in charge of the fleet forces for the largest navy in the world, the Royal Navy. And when they get over here, they start to devise a plan. Just a few months into it, they have a major victory at Bladensburg, and after they have that victory, they march down to Washington, D.C., and they have basically a fire party. They set Washington, D.C. on fire. And from here in Baltimore, you could have looked south and you could have seen the orange glow at night of Washington City burning in the night. The residents here in Baltimore are very aware of what's happening right off the coast. They can actually see the ships sometimes from the coastline, and they know that they're piling up and that there's a plan for an attack to happen here in Baltimore. And that really sets the stage for what we have here at Fort McHenry. And we'll go out to the fort today and we'll check out the actual structure itself, which has changed many times over the years and has been refitted and restructured to suit different eras of war, including the Civil War. We'll talk about 1814 and the battle that took place out here. And we'll talk about the insurrection that happened in town in Baltimore and what this ultimately turned into during the Civil War, this prison camp here. So why here? Here we have a fort that's named after George Washington's secretary, and it is placed here in 1800, and it protects the inner harbor of Baltimore, which was the third largest city at the time, and it had about 50,000 citizens in it. It was also the largest port in the United States, and so it was very important at that time. 50,000 people doesn't seem like a lot of people today, but at that time it was a massive amount of people. To give you a little comparison, they had the land battle here. The land battle had 5,000 British soldiers and 1,000 American soldiers, and the total casualty count for the battle here at the fort was 24 Americans and 1 British sailor. That's not a lot, but this was considered a huge victory because the British fleet backed off and went down to New Orleans. So if you compare that to the counts of casualties to some of the smallest battles in the American Civil War, this seems like somebody just got into an argument. It's September 12th, 1814, and the Brits have landed a combined force of soldiers, sailors, and Marines out here at North Point. It's roughly about 4,000 to 5,000 of them, and General Sam Smith knows that the fight is coming. So he decides to order Mr. Stricker to take his men out and engage with those soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and to try to slow their advance down, which is essentially what he does. He goes out there and engages with them and slows them down. Realizing that there's something happening, about midday, those Brits decide to take a break for some reason and have lunch. While they're being engaged, and the fight starts. Robert Ross hears the noise and decides to ride out on his big, beautiful horse and see for himself to see what's happening. He gets out there to see the fight and gets popped right in the chest. He goes down off of his horse, and the general that's in charge of the British forces on land dies from a gunshot wound to the chest. So now Colonel Brooke is in charge. Robert Ross is dead, and the Americans have stalled the army so much so that they're able to better prepare for the fight. The Americans put up a really good fight out here at North Point, but eventually they have to fall back, so they fall back to the city of Baltimore. That night, for some reason, the British decide to take it easy. They take a rest. They stop for the night. And what that does is it sets up the ability for the British, or the American soldiers that is, and the town of Baltimore to prepare for the fight that's coming in the morning. And prepare they did. Major Armistead gets ready here because he knows that there's going to be a naval fleet coming towards him. The town itself prepares, and 10,000 regulars go up the Philadelphia, I believe it's the Philadelphia street, and they are basically blocking the way of the forces that are supposed to be coming towards Baltimore. Now the forces initially were 5-1 for the British side, but now they are outnumbered 2-1. And so they know that they can't fight in that kind of situation, so they realize that the Navy now has to get involved. So that's when they decide to send those smaller ships up here to fight out here at Fort McHenry. So in the early morning hours of the 13th of September, the bomb vessels are sent from the British fleet. And the reason why they're sent is because the inner harbor out here and the river that they have to go down is kind of shallow. So the larger ships, the larger warships can't make it out here. So they send those bomb vessels out here to attack the fort. And the bomb vessels are the HMS Terror, Volcano, Meteor, Devastation, Etna. And then there's a rocket ship that's also sent out here. So whenever the stanza says, and the rocket's red glare, that's what they're talking about, because at the time there was a brand new type of warfare that was happening. These rockets were created, and they were actually used out here for some of the first fights here in the United States. So we just got done with the flag ceremony, and I'm going up top here to take a look from the ramparts here at Fort McHenry. We'll show you a little bit of the bay and the locations where the ships would have been. Here we are at the top of the ramparts here at Fort McHenry. On that fateful day, when the bombardment started, ships actually came out from this direction over here. They were coming directly head on to the fort itself. And they sent their ships from the fleet that was further out, the British did. And when the ships got to this location, they started unloading on Fort McHenry. Well, almost immediately when they came up this bay area, Major Armistead opened up all of his guns all at once and just let them have it. And it hit them pretty hard. Those ships started to back off and go back to the fleet out there in that water. And they realized immediately they had to come up with another course of action. So they started their siege of this fort. And the only reason why this fort was important in the first place and why they were sieging it was because 4,000 British regulars had already been landed and they were coming ashore to try to take Baltimore. This location prevented the largest navy in the world from coming up and taking it by sea. So if it weren't for Fort McHenry and Major Armistead's actions here, the flag that would have been flying over this place would have definitely been a British flag. The location I'm standing at today would have been like a sentry point for guard to come up top here of the fort, to walk around the top side and to make sure that everything is okay and working properly. Officers of the deck would have also come up here to take a look as well. I've seen a lot of historically significant things, but the thing behind me right now is very significant. This underneath the glass is the actual cross section that held the pole that the flag went on during that fateful day. When you come out to Fort McHenry, you're going to see a lot of artillery pieces around the fort itself, large guns. And if you look at the front of the gun, you can actually see the date that the gun was forged in iron. And a lot of these weapons that are out here are dated post the Civil War. There's one large gun here that's dated 1863 that I've found so far. The rest of them are like 1877, 1878 time frame. You're not going to find too many pieces in here that are original to what happened during the time of 1814. And the majority of those older pieces are actually on the inside of the fort itself, right next to where they would roll the cartridges and store the gunpowder. There's going to be a lot of wind out here today, so hopefully it's not too windy and you can actually hear what I'm saying. So I'm walking up over here, and the very large gun, let's see if we can see it real quick, right next to my Dunkin' Donuts coffee. That very large gun over there, I walked around the edge of the fort and I saw that it was dated 1863. A lot of these guns out here are dated post-Civil War, but that one's dated 1863, which means it was forged at that time. This fort, which was known for Francis Scott Key and the Star Spangled Banner and freedom and things like that, was actually used to be turned against the citizens of Baltimore. The citizens of Baltimore were turning against the United States. They were basically insurrectionists at that time. There was a large riot that happened in downtown, and citizens down there wanted to secede from the United States. President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and he decided to take political prisoners and put them here inside this fort. And then he told the officers in charge here to turn their guns towards the city of Baltimore and to squash the insurrection that was happening in downtown Baltimore. Well, the threat worked. The city eventually calmed down, and all of the people that were against the United States at the time and were trying to secede were either taken prisoner, or they got real quiet, or they left. Maryland, as a result, stayed with the United States. Although Maryland itself did raise several regiments for the Confederate States, which is why when you go to American Civil War battlefields, you will see monuments to Maryland units for the Confederate States on those battlefields. So what happened with the naval battle? Well, basically those ships were sent upriver and they were placed out here to fight against this fort. And the fort was manned with about 1,000 soldiers inside and some sailors. And they manned the guns the best they could, and Major Armistead placed them where he needed to place them. For about 27 hours, a bombardment took place out here to attack this fort. And at the time it was overcast and it was raining. It was a miserable place to be, but they did the best they could. The ships that floated up the river to come up here on the initial attack blasted away, and then when they received that first volley that came from the fort, they realized that they needed to back out of range. So they started to back down the river a little bit out of range, and they fired their cannons towards this fort. There were about 1,500 rounds that were initially fired out here during that 27-hour siege, and it did very little damage to the fort. It did very little damage to the morale inside this fort too, which that's kind of key when it comes to a battle. If the men inside are demoralized, then the fort is going to be taken because they're going to quit their post. But the men inside were determined to win this battle, and win it they did. I've been to many different forts and national parks throughout the United States, and for example, St. Augustine, their fort down there, the fort in Key West, Florida, many of the different forts up and down the East Coast. But I've not quite seen a fort so well preserved as this one. The structures on the inside they're pretty well put together. There's nothing falling apart, unlike some of the forts in the Keys and in Florida. And it's just a really great place to visit. And General Armistead here, or Major Armistead, has a connection to another famous Armistead. The Armistead family fought throughout many of the wars in the United States. And one of his famous ancestors or relatives was the famous Armistead that fought at Pickett's Charge and died shortly thereafter. His family actually kept the flag all those years, and there's a good book that you can read authored by Tom McMillan that talks about the Armistead family and that flag and its journey throughout history and how it was preserved and saved. I recommend you picking it up and reading it. It's a really good book. But that's one of the connections to Gettysburg. Major Armistead himself had a wife who had a child, and he sent that wife to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He thought that was far enough inland that if Baltimore was taken, that she'd be safe. Well, Baltimore wasn't taken, and she was safe anyhow. Unfortunately for Major Armistead, he dies at a young age. And then his relative years later dies at the Battle of Gettysburg. Sometimes you just got to stop and take it all in. Well, that flag that's hoisted up behind me right now is one of the larger flags that they just hoisted up here. And that's part of that ceremony I was telling you about. The National Park Service does it every morning and every afternoon. And they change the flag out to the smaller flag at night and the larger flag during the daytime. One of the requirements to fly a flag at night, however, is that you have spotlighting on that flag. And so they have that in place here so that they can fly that flag. So if you do have a flag at your home and you have it out at night, you need to have a spotlight on the flag to properly fly it. Now the place that I'm in right now was a bastion marked by death. In this location here, there were soldiers that died at their post. 2 men were killed up here. A bomb bursted overhead and essentially took out a couple of soldiers. One of them was a lieutenant by the name of Levi. And he died right here in this position. The history of this place is pretty magnificent, regardless of what the death count is or the casualty count. The ground that I'm walking on right now is essentially the beginning of the United States. Realistically, we won the American Revolution. We were seen as a country, but we stood for revolutionary ideas. The War of 1812 made us stand for so much more. And it's thanks to the sacrifices of the people that were in this fort and many other places around the country during the War of 1812 that we were able to progress forward and become what we are today. And then eventually, some of the people related to the people that progressed us as a country in the War of 1812 would break off and fight against the very country that their ancestors established in the American Civil War. So I'm in front of the Francis Scott Key tablet right now, which was dedicated here at the 100th anniversary of the Star Spangled Banner. So it seemed like a good time to talk about Francis Scott Key. So Francis Scott Key was a political prisoner. He was on a ship out there, out in the bay, and he could hear and see what was happening here towards Fort McHenry. And all through the day and through the night, he was pretty much afraid that there was going to be a British flag flying above this fort by the time the morning came. When 9 o'clock came and that large flag started whipping out above the fort, it inspired him to write down just a few lines for the defense of Fort McHenry, which eventually was turned into the Star Spangled Banner. And then in 1931, that became our national anthem. So in the middle of the night, Admiral Cochrane decides that he needs to do a diversionary tactic. He decides to land more forces on the ground, and he sends them around the south side of the fort, trying to draw more troops out of the area where the 10,000 soldiers are that are blocking the way. When he sends them out there, it doesn't work. the attack stalls, and they realize that the primary focus has to be here at the fort, because if they can get this fort cleared, then they can get around the other side and they can get into Baltimore and attack from the sea. So he sends those forces. It doesn't work. He continues to fight over here, and they continue to lob shells. And like I said earlier, we're looking at about 1,500 rounds that are lobbed over here. Rockets, mortars, cannonballs, all kinds of stuff. They're just blown up over top. And the majority of the things that are flying at this fort are fused cannonballs or shot. And so how it works is it flies up, it comes over top of the fort, and then boom, it's supposed to explode and rain havoc down onto the fort. And sometimes the shells will actually come in and hit structures in the fort. Luckily for the people inside here and Major Armistead, the 32-year-old commander that was here at the time, not a lot of damage was done. And there were only a few soldiers that were killed inside of here. By 7:30 in the morning, the last shot rang out from one of the British ships, and the realization for the Brits that this was not a good point to attack came that morning. They stopped firing. Well, determined, Major Armistead pulls out this huge flag that was commissioned and made by Mary Pickersgill. And this large, I believe the size was 32 by 40 feet, was pulled out and hoisted above the fort on a pole similar to this one, all the way to the top. And out there, near where the bridge is today, Francis Scott Key could see that flag going over top. And he wrote those famous words that becomes our Star Spangled Banner. And here in just a moment, they will raise a flag in honor of that moment here at Fort McHenry. And they do it every single day. They replace a smaller flag with a larger flag. Now, in this location that's directly behind me outside of the fort, there once stood a vast hospital. During the Civil War, there was also hospital buildings and prisoner of war camps out here too. But during World War I, a lot of the wounded soldiers were coming over from France here and being serviced and helped here at this hospital on the grounds. Now, coming into the entrance of the fort here, there's a sign that details the type of buildings that were out here just on the outer edge of the fort from 1814. And one of the buildings, of course, was a tavern. Not unlike most of the military installations today, just outside the base, you'll find some place for a soldier or sailor to get in trouble. It's been fantastic weather out here. It's been a great time at Fort McHenry, bringing some of the history. And thanks to books like the one written by Tom McMillan, you can gain a lot of knowledge about this fort and about the flag that once flew here as well, and Mr. Armistead and his family. I highly encourage you to pick one up and check it out. Until next time, from Fort McHenry, this is History with Waffles.